Nora Callum had 3 hours to find $10 she did not have, and one thing left in the world worth selling. A white horse her dying father had told her never to sell to anyone but the man across the valley. She had counted the hours from the moment Harlan Voss came to her door that morning, the second morning in a row, and told her with the patience of a man who dislikes repeating himself that the amount was $14, and that if it was not on his desk before sundown he would file with the county office at first light. Once that began, the legal fees would be added on. He would not stop the sale. $14. She had $4.40. If you have ever been looked at as a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected, if you have ever had to hand over the last thing you loved just to keep the ground under your feet, then stay with me. This one is for you. Let me take you back to a hard valley in the high country, and a white horse named Hope, and a leather-handled tool that had been passed between two good men before it ever came to rest. Montana high country did not care about anyone's arithmetic, and Nora Callum had run hers 3 times that morning standing in the cold yard, and it came out the same each time. She had $4.40 after selling the last of the autumn preserves, after the embroidery she delivered to Mrs. Caldwell on Tuesday, after 3 shirts finished by lamplight on Wednesday, with her eyes burning from the strain. $4.40 was not 14. There was no arrangement of the numbers that made it 14. She had learned the numbers the way she'd learned everything worth keeping, at her father's elbow. James Callum had not been a warm man in the way of men who say soft things easily, but he had been a warm man in the way that counts, which is the way that shows up in the cold. He had taught her to read weather off the shoulder of the mountain before she could read letters. He had taught her which of the neighbors would lend a hand and ask nothing, and which would lend a hand and remember it against you. And he had taught her the ledger, sat her at the plank table on winter nights with a stub of pencil, and made her carry the columns until they balanced. Because a farm, he said, was not saved in the field so much as at the table, in the long accounting of what came in against what went out. She stood in the yard after Voss left, and looked at the small place her father had worked for 22 years. The cabin, the pole barn, the half-dozen chickens, the kitchen garden gone brown at the edges for lack of time to tend it. It was not much to look at, but every board of it had a story she knew, and every fence post had been set by a hand she still missed with a physical ache some mornings, and the ground itself held 22 years of a man's labor the way good ground holds everything you put into it. And she understood, with the clear, cold understanding that arrives when you have finally run out of alternatives, that there was exactly one thing left she could turn into money before sundown. Hope was in the paddock. The white horse lifted his head when she came to the rail and pushed his nose into her shoulder the way he had since he was 2 years old, when her father had brought him home leading him behind the wagon and said, "This one's for you, Nora. He'll look after you when I can't." She had been 19. She had laughed and said her father would look after her a long while yet. He had not corrected her. He had only put the lead in her hand and folded her fingers around it, and there had been something in his face even then, 2 years before the cough set in, that she had not understood until much later. Her father had been dead 14 months. Hope had been looking after her the whole of it. Land is lost more often to bad arithmetic than to bad weather, her father used to say, and she had kept his books and her own for 14 months, and she did not stand at that paddock rail and pretend the numbers would change. They would not change. She needed $10 she did not have, and she had one thing worth more than $10, and she was going to take it to the one man her father had trusted to treat it right. He'd told her, in the last month of his life, with the plainness of a man who knew he was leaving things unfinished, "If you ever have to let Hope go, take him to Robert Shaw. He knows horses. He's a fair man. He'll treat the animal right." He'd said it once clearly, without repeating himself, the way he said things he meant. In a house where a thing said twice was a thing you hadn't been trusted to hear the first time. She had carried it 14 months without needing it, the way you carry a key to a door you hope never to have to open. She needed it now. She went inside and got her coat. The Callum place sat on 40 acres on the east side of the valley. Not the best ground, not the worst. The kind that gave you enough if you worked it right. It had been enough for one man and a daughter and a horse. It was not enough for one woman alone, and that was a thing Nora had not understood when her father died so much as learned, slowly, over 14 months, the way you learn things that arrive without announcement. First as a suspicion, then as arithmetic that would not come right. She had tried everything. She could sew a shirt in 3 hours when the light was good, and the women on the bigger outfits paid a fair wage for skilled work. She sold preserves and cured meat at the Cedar Falls market on Saturdays. She delivered all of it herself on Hope, who was the reason delivery was possible at all, and who ate feed that cost money she did not quite have. The debt had started small. In the week after her father's funeral, she'd needed money for the property tax, the feed bill, and a barn roof that would not wait for winter. She'd borrowed $22 from Harlan Voss on terms that had seemed reasonable until she understood them, and by the time she understood them, understanding was a luxury she'd already spent. She had been paying down the principal ever since, with the patience of someone moving a boulder an inch at a time, making the same walk to the lending office most of a year. She'd missed one payment in September, when a mule kicked over her sewing basket and a sprained wrist cost her 4 days of work at the one thing that paid her reliably. She'd missed another last week, when the first hard snow came early, and the feed she'd counted on buying cheap in October had to be bought dear in November instead. 2 missed payments. She had not understood, until Voss came to the door that morning, how carefully a certain kind of man counts another person's stumbles. This morning, Voss had come in person. She'd listened on the porch with her hands still floured from the bread she'd been making when he knocked. He was not a large man, nor a loud one. He wore a good coat and clean boots and the mild, unhurried manner of a man who has learned that patience is the cheapest tool for taking things from people who have run short of it. He had laid the arithmetic out for her the way you'd explain a simple matter to a child. The $8 of principal, the interest, the penalty for the second late notice, 14 in all, and he had done it without any heat at all, which was somehow worse than cruelty. Because cruelty at least grants that the other person matters enough to be cruel to. She had not argued, because there was nothing to argue with. The terms were the terms, she had signed them. But it was not the arithmetic that stayed with her after he rode off. It was the way his eyes had moved. Once, past her shoulder, over the cabin, the barn, and out to the low ground on the north end where the spring came up out of the rock and ran clear and cold and steady even in the driest August the valley had ever known. He had looked at that spring the way a man looks at a thing he has already decided to own, and then he had looked back at her and touched his hat and told her $14 by sundown or he filed in the morning. When he was gone, she went back in and finished the bread, because the bread needed finishing and because her hands needed something to do that they knew how to do. She made 12 loaves and stacked them on the table and stood a moment in the smell of it, the one plainly good thing in a morning that had gone wrong at the root. Then she got her coat. The shore place was 12 minutes from the Callum property on horseback. 12 minutes that covered, in every way that mattered, the distance between 2 entirely different lives. 500 acres of the best valley land. A cabin built big and built to last, set back against a stand of pine with the mountains rising behind it. The largest barn in the county, and the man himself out in the corral when she rode up, working a young horse in the patient way that asks the animal to understand rather than telling it. A big man. Dark hair well past his collar and no hat on his head. A thick dark beard. The kind of man the high country makes and keeps. Not a rancher in a clean coat. a mountain man who had come down out of the timber years ago and put down roots in the valley and never lost the look of the country he'd come from. Robert Shaw had come into the place at 28, 8 years back, and made it pay by the plain method of working harder than anyone else and asking good questions of people who knew more than he did. He'd known her father the way good neighbors know each other, a shared fence line, a shared respect, the odd conversation at the Cedar Falls market. He had watched the Callum place from across the valley for 14 months and had not once come to the door, because James Callum's daughter was plainly capable and plainly proud, and interfering with capable. Proud people was the surest way he knew to end a good neighborhood for good. He'd told himself that more than once, on the evenings he'd seen the lamp burning late in the Callum cabin from the ridge. He saw her at the gate and read something in the way she sat, straight, the way you sit when you are holding something together, and handed the young horse's lead to a lean older man named Tom, and came over. Tom watched him go with the expression of a man filing a thing away for later. He stopped at the gate. Nora, Robert, she had rehearsed 3 versions of what she meant to say on the ride over. None of them came out. What came out was, "I need to sell hope." He looked at the white horse. He looked at her. He said nothing, which was the right thing, because she needed to get through it, and his silence gave her the room. Harlan Voss is calling the debt today, before sundown. I'm short $9.60, and I've nothing left to sell but him. She held his gaze. My father told me if I ever had to let Hope go, I should bring him to you. He said you'd treat him right. Robert looked at the horse a long moment. Hope looked back at him with the calm attention of an animal taking a careful measure of a man. How much do you need? $10. That covers the gap and gets me through the month. She kept her chin level. I know what he's worth. I know $10 isn't it. But it's what I need, and it's what I'm asking. Robert Shaw stood at his own gate on a cold Monday afternoon and thought about 14 months of a lamp burning late up on the Callum Ridge, and about a man who had once told him, not as a suggestion but as a plain statement of fact, that his daughter was the most capable person on either side of their fence line. Come inside, he said. There's something we ought to talk about that isn't a sale. She followed him, because there was no better option in front of her. He held the door. She sat at the kitchen table, and her legs were more tired than she'd let herself feel on the ride. He set coffee to heat, and she did not refuse it. While the coffee came up, she looked around the kitchen, because she could not help it. Reading a room was a thing her father had trained into her so deep she no longer noticed doing it. The cabin was solid and well built and plainly a man's, kept clean enough but kept without any sense of a place that expected to be lived in past supper. The pantry had been laid in by a man who understood cattle and did not understand provisioning, bulk goods in the wrong order. No system for rotation, flour stacked next to a can of kerosene, which was a fire risk and simply wrong besides. A good side of bacon hung where the stove heat would turn it before spring. There were 3 lamps and oil for one. She filed all of it, the way she filed everything, and looked back at the table. You're short $9.60, he said. Yes, and after you pay today the principal left is $8. Payments $2 a month. Yes. He sat down across from her and drank his coffee and went still in a particular way, the way she'd seen him go at the market, when he was working out something he meant to get right. She had watched him do it once, over a lame ox another man was trying to sell him, standing quiet for a full minute while the seller talked, and then naming the exact joint that was wrong before the seller had finished lying about it. He was not a quick man. He was a thorough one, and she had come to understand at the market that the two were not the same, and that the second was rarer and worth more. I'm not looking for charity, she said. I know you're not. He held her gaze. I'm not offering any. I'm looking for someone to run the household side of this place, the accounts, the provisioning, the ordering, the schedule. My housekeeper left in August, went to her sister's down in the low country, and I haven't replaced her because I didn't know how to look for what I needed. I've got 5 men, and no system for anything that happens inside these walls." He glanced at the pantry she'd already taken apart with her eyes. "I feed those men out of a pot and my own bad temper, and it costs me more than it should and pleases nobody. The position pays $3 a week. You'd keep your own property. Ride over daily or stay here through the hard weeks, as the work runs." She looked at him. "That's a fair wage for that work. It's what the work is worth. I don't gain anything paying you less than it's worth. I just get worse work, and a person who's looking to leave. I've run enough men long enough to know that much. If I take it, I cover Voss today out of an advance, and I'm clear of the shortfall in 3 weeks. Yes, I'll advance you 10 against the first wages. You pay Voss. You keep the horse he works out of here. Better paddock, better feed, and honest work to do, which a horse like that wants as much as a person does." He held her gaze. "That's a practical arrangement that serves us both. You get a wage and your horse gets a paddock, and I get a house that runs. Nobody's giving anybody anything they haven't earned." She looked at the kitchen. She looked at the pantry. She looked at this man who had known her father, who had watched 14 months of a lamp burning late from the ridge and never once come to the door. "Why didn't you come before?" she said. He looked at his cup a moment before he answered, which she respected, because a man who answered that question fast was either lying or had rehearsed it, and neither would have been worth much. "Because you didn't ask. And because your father told me once that you had more pride than good sense," which he meant as the highest compliment he had in him, and which I took the same way. A pause. A proud person who's managing doesn't want a neighbor turning up to inform them they're drowning. It's the surest way to make an enemy of someone you meant to help. So I watched, and I told myself watching was respect. He turned the cup a quarter turn on the table. Maybe it was. Maybe I respected it a little too long. I've thought about that more than once, seeing that lamp lit at midnight from my own ridge. She sat in Robert Shaw's kitchen with $4.40 to her name and 2 hours until sundown, and thought about her father, who had said take him to Robert Shaw, he'll treat the animal right. She had thought he meant the horse. "All right," she said. "I'll take the position." He stood. "I'll get the 10. She paid Harlan Voss at 4:45. He took the money with the look of a man who had expected a different afternoon, counting it twice, though he'd named the sum himself. And she did not explain where it had come from, and she did not miss the way his eyes moved over her once, reassessing, as though a plan he'd been quietly building had just lost a piece and he was already looking for where to set it back. He gave her a receipt in a careful clerk's hand and said, "Current, then, for now," and the "for now" stayed with her the whole ride home. She walked out to Hope at the rail and put her forehead against the white horse's neck and stood there a moment in the last of the Cedar Falls light, breathing in the warm horse smell of him, the one steady thing in 14 months of unsteady ground. Then she rode home and made supper and went to bed and did not let herself add up how close it had come, because the adding up would keep her awake, and morning came early. She started at the Shore Ranch on Wednesday. The house accounts were a disaster, not from neglect, but from the piled-up disorder of a busy man who understood cattle and had no system for anything indoors. Bills paid twice, and bills not paid at all. Receipts stuffed in a drawer without dates. A supplier's ledger that did not match the man's own count of what he'd received, in the supplier's favor, every single month. She spent the first day taking inventory of all of it, going drawer by drawer and shelf by shelf with a lamp and a fresh sheet of paper, the way her father had taught her to walk a piece of trouble end to end before you decide how to fix it. She spent the second day building a system, a place for receipts, a schedule for payments, a running count of stores against the calendar so a man would know in October what he'd want in February. On Friday afternoon, Tom came into the kitchen where she was rebuilding the pantry and stopped in the doorway. Tom was the oldest of the 5 hands, lean and gray and dry as a creek bed in August, and he had the particular authority of a man who had worked the place longer than the man who owned it, and had decided long ago to have opinions about everything and share almost none of them. "Sugar was where I could find it," he said. She looked at him. The sugar was next to the kerosene. I knew where it was. It was also a fire waiting to happen. One spilled lamp and this whole cabin goes up, and every man on this place with it. Tom looked at the sugar's new home. He looked at Nora. He looked at the sugar again. "Robert know you moved everything?" "Robert hired me to run the house. The pantry's in the house." Tom leaned in the doorframe with the expression of a man who has just watched something worth remembering. "You've been here 3 days. The pantry needed doing on day 1. I was being patient." He nodded slowly, and something at the corner of his mouth moved that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. "Robert's going to notice." "Good," she said. Tom went back out. He found Robert at the south fence and said, without preamble, "New housekeeper moved the sugar." Robert looked at him. "That a problem?" Tom considered it a moment, the way he considered everything, as though the question deserved more care than it had been given. No, he went back to work. But he had said it, which for Tom was a speech, and Robert understood that too, and looked at the cabin a moment before he went back to the cattle. That evening, when Robert came in for supper and could not find the flour where the flour had lived for 6 years, he stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing, because Nora was at the stove and the kitchen smelled like fresh bread and something with onions in it, and he understood, in the specific way of a man who has been eating his own bad cooking for 6 years, that this was better, and that the question of the flour could keep. He ate 2 helpings. He did not say it was good, because he was not a man who said such things, but he ate 2 helpings, and Nora, who had fed her father for years and knew exactly what a second helping meant from a man who did not say things, took it for what it was. She told him about the overpayments on Friday. She'd been braced for a reaction and wasn't sure which kind. Some men did not like to be shown they'd been cheated, took it as a slight on their own sense rather than a service done them. He sat at the table and looked at the figures she'd laid out. 3 suppliers, 6 months, $11.40 overpaid, every figure sourced and dated. With the look of a man reading something he wished he'd known sooner and trying not to show how much it stung. "You found this in 3 days. The filing had room for improvement." "How much room?" "Considerable." She looked at the ledger. "My father taught me to keep the books before he taught me to saddle a horse. Land is lost more often to bad arithmetic than bad weather." Robert looked at the figures. Then he looked at her and said a thing she had not expected. He said that. "About you." She looked at him. "About me." "Last time I spoke to him, month before he died, he picked up the pencil she'd set down and set it down again, which she was learning was a thing his hands did when his mind was somewhere that made him uncertain. We were at the market and he was tired, I could see it on him, though he'd not have said a word, and he looked over at you across the way, arguing a fair price for those preserves of yours with old Hendricks, and getting it, and he said the Callum farm would outlast him, because his Nora kept better books than he did. He held her gaze. I took it for a father's comfort at the time, a dying man telling himself his girl would be all right. I'm starting to think he meant it plainer than that, as information, as a thing a man ought to know. Nora looked at the ledger. She thought about a man who had kept the books and the fence line and the horse and the last instruction all in the same careful corner of his mind, and had spent the last month of his life setting each of them down in the one place it would do the most good. the way he set his stamp in the handle of a tool so it would always find its way home. "I've written the 3 suppliers," she said, when she could. "You'll have corrections by month's end." Robert looked at the figures one more time. 3 a week, he said. "That's still the rate? It's what you offered. It's not enough for what you're doing here. We agreed 3. We can renegotiate." "Robert," she held his gaze. "Don't change the terms." He understood what she meant, or enough of it, that she needed the arrangement to be exactly what it was, a wage for work, clean and countable, until she understood what else it might be turning into. That changing the number now, even upward, even kindly, would turn a thing she could stand on into a thing she'd have to wonder about. He nodded. 3, as agreed. And he went back to the cattle, and she went back to the ledger, and Tom, who'd been mending a harness in the next room and heard all of it, said nothing and made a private note, and, later that week, moved his own tobacco tin off the shelf above the stove without being asked, which was as close as Tom came to an announcement of allegiance. Harlan Voss came back on a grey afternoon in the last week of November, and he did not come to the Callum place. He came to the shore ranch. Nora was at the kitchen window when she saw him ride in and step down at the yard, and something in her went cold and still. She met him on the porch before he reached the door, because whatever this was, it was hers to meet. "Miss Callum." Voss took off his hat with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. "I heard you'd taken a position out here. Convenient, saves me a longer ride. You've been paid, Mr. Voss. The account's current. It is. For now." He turned his hat in his hands, but you'll recall the note was secured against the Callum property. 40 acres, a good spring, timber on the north end. That spring's worth more than the whole rest of the parcel to the right buyer. A man building toward the mill trade needs water he can count on. He smiled, thin. "You've missed 2 payments already this year, a third, and the note falls into default, and the property comes to settlement. I'm a patient man. I can wait for a third." She understood him then, all the way down. The $14 had never been the point. The spring was the point. He'd been waiting 14 months for a woman alone to slip once too often, and he meant to help her slip. "I don't intend to miss a third," she said level. "People rarely intend to." He put his hat back on. "But intentions and hard winters are 2 different things, Miss Callum. Mind the difference." He rode off. She stood on the porch with her hands folded hard in front of her, and she did not hear Robert come up until he was beside her. "That was Voss," he said. Not a question. He'd know the man. That was Voss. What did he want? She could have managed it herself. She'd managed everything herself for 14 months. But she had taken his wage and stood on his porch, and a half-truth would have been its own kind of lie, and she found she did not want to tell this man even a small one. "He wants the Callum spring," she said. "The debt was only ever the way in. He's waiting for me to miss a third payment, so the property falls into default and he can take it to settlement and sell the water to the mill trade. The $14 was never the point. The point is under the north end of my land, running clear and cold in the worst August this valley's ever had. And he means to have it." Robert was quiet a moment, looking at the road where Voss had gone. She watched him take it in the way he took everything, slowly, all the way to the bottom, no piece of it wasted. "Can he do it?" "If I miss a third payment, yes, the note's secured against the land." She kept her voice even. "I don't mean to miss it." "No," Robert said. "I don't imagine you do." And he did not offer to pay it off, and he did not tell her not to worry, and he did not say a single one of the things a lesser man would have reached for to make himself feel useful. She noticed all of those absences, and understood what each of them cost him. Because she could see plainly that he wanted to do something, it was in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand closed once and opened, and that he was holding to don't change the terms even now, even against a threat like this, because she had asked him to. That mattered more than an offer of money would have. An offer of money would have told her he was kind. The holding back told her he had heard her, actually heard her 3 weeks ago and kept it, and there was no amount of money that could have bought what that was worth. If it comes to it, she said, I'll ask. That's a thing I can promise. If I'm going under and there's no other way, I'll come to you and ask, plainly. But I need to be the one who asks. Do you understand the difference? I do, he said. I understand it better than I did a month ago. He looked at her. It's the difference between a partner and a project. I've been on the wrong side of that before, meaning well. I'd as soon not be again. She looked at him a moment longer than she needed to. No, she said. I'd as soon you weren't either. December came to the high country, the way it always came, without negotiation. The lower fence rails vanished under the drifts, the creek froze at the edges and ran narrow and black down the middle. The cold came down off the peaks at night with a weight you could feel through a good wall, and the mornings broke so still and so hard that the smoke from the cabin chimney went straight up into a sky the color of a knife. Nora's 12-minute ride became 40 minutes of careful work through snow that Hope navigated with the patience of an animal that has done harder things and expects to do harder still. On the third day of it, Robert said, without ceremony, standing in the doorway knocking snow off his boots, that the east bedroom sat empty and had a good stove in it, and it made no sense, no practical sense, he said, leaning on the word the way she leaned on hers. For her to ride 40 minutes in the dark at both ends of a working day when the work was here and the room was here, and going to waste. She moved into the east bedroom. She told herself it was practical, and it was. And she told herself so again every morning when she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee before the house woke, watching the high country dark go gray. Go the particular blue of a winter morning, listening for the creak of the third floorboard in the hall that she now knew meant Robert was up. She had learned the house the way she learned everything, without meaning to and all the way through. She knew he took his coffee black and drank it too fast and burned himself on it about 1 morning in 3 and never once learned from it. She knew he read at the table 20 minutes every morning before he went out. A worn book of maps, mostly. And sometimes a seed catalogue he studied like scripture, and that on the mornings something was working at him, he read the same page twice without noticing he'd done it. There had been more second reads in December than in November. She did not let herself wonder too hard what was on the pages he wasn't reading. One evening she found him in the barn after supper, working a harness by lamplight. That was not unusual. He did his thinking with his hands, the way some men did it with a bottle, and the barn at night was where he went to think. What was unusual was the thing on the bench beside him, a leather-handled tool. Old, the kind of thing that had been mended more than once, and used carefully, and mended again, the leather of the handle gone dark and smooth with the oil of a working hand. She knew the mark stamped into the butt of the handle before she knew anything else about it. A small, deliberate stamp, a J and a C crossed at the stems. It was her father's mark. He had set it into everything he made or mended, so that a thing lent out would always carry its way home in it. That was his, she said. Her voice did not come out quite even, and she let it not. Robert looked at the tool. He looked at her, and she saw him understand that he'd left it out where she'd find it, and had perhaps meant to and perhaps hadn't, and was now caught between the two. He lent it to me 4 years back, he said. A fence job. Mine, not his. He came over and worked 2 days on my line for no reason but that it wanted doing, and he was a better hand at it than me. And he left this behind. And when I tried to give it back, he said, keep it till the next job. There was always going to be a next job. He turned it over in his hands. After he passed, I thought about carrying it up to you 100 times. And He stopped and looked at the lamp, and the light moved on the side of his face. I kept it because it was the last thing he ever put in my hand. I should have brought it up to you the week of the funeral. I didn't know how to walk up to a grieving girl with her dead father's tool and no words to go with it. So I kept it. That was for me, not for you. And it was wrong of me, and I'm sorry for it. She crossed the barn in the December cold and took the tool from his hands and looked at the stamp in the handle. The J and the C crossed at the stems, worn but clear. She had last seen it in her father's hand, mending the paddock gate the autumn before he died, his breath already short by then, though he'd not have said so. She turned it once and felt the balance of it, the exact weight her father's hand had known, and she gave it back. "Keep it," she said. He'd want it used, not sitting in a drawer up at my place mourning him. He never had any patience for a thing that wasn't earning its keep, and that includes grief. She almost smiled, and did not quite. "Keep it. Use it. That's how you carry a man properly, not by setting his things aside." Robert held it. He held her gaze in the lamplight a long moment. "He talked about you," he said. "Often, every time I saw him," she said. She went back inside and did not examine too closely what she was feeling, which was the specific warmth of a place that had begun, somewhere between November and December, to feel like hers. Not the wage, not the room, but the thing underneath them. The thing she had not gone looking for, and did not yet have a safe name for. On the first Monday of January, she rode to Cedar Falls to make the monthly payment on the Voss note, $2 exact, in an envelope she'd readied Sunday night. She set it on the counter. The clerk looked at it, looked at his ledger, and looked at her with the expression of a man whose records do not match the woman in front of him. "Miss Callum." The account's settled. She looked at him. "What?" "In full." He turned the ledger toward her. January the 4th. $8 against the whole remaining principal. Accounts closed. Nora looked at the entry. January the 4th. She had been at the Shore Ranch that whole day, the morning on the provision schedule, the afternoon on a wheel spoke Tom could not set right. She looked at the name beside the payment. Robert Shaw. She folded the $2 envelope back into her pocket. She thanked the clerk. She walked out onto the boardwalk and stood there a moment while the high country January went about its business, cold and entirely indifferent to what she was feeling. He had closed the note. He had closed the door Voss was waiting at, taken the spring off the table, taken the whole threat off the table, and said not one word to her about it. And that was the trouble. She thought about a Monday in November, and a man who had said, "That's a practical arrangement that serves us both." She thought about "Don't change the terms" in 3, as agreed. She thought about a leather-handled tool on a workbench, and second reads at the breakfast table, and $8 paid on the 4th of January without a word. She got on Hope and rode back, and she did not decide what she was going to say. She decided only that she'd say it before she found a reason not to. He was at the south fence when she came. She rode to him and stepped down and stood beside him. He looked at her and read her face and set down the wire he was holding, because he knew already this was not a thing to be half done during. "You went to the lending office," he said. "Yes." He looked at the fence. "Nora, it was $8, she said. "That's not the point, so don't tell me it was only $8. I know what it was. I know it's not the point. You took Voss off my back without asking me. You decided it. For me." She was very still, and her voice was low and even, which anyone who knew her would have found more alarming than shouting. "That spring was mine to defend. That fight was mine, the one thing in 14 months that was clean, that was mine to win or lose on my own account. And you closed it out one morning while I was in your kitchen setting a wheel spoke, and you said nothing. For 3 weeks. You let me carry a fear that was already gone. You let me lie awake over a thing you'd already fixed. And you did it because you decided I shouldn't have to carry it, which is the same thing Voss did, in the end. You both looked at me and decided what I could carry. He decided I couldn't carry the debt. You decided I shouldn't carry the fight. Neither one of you asked. That last landed on him. She watched it land. He did not flinch from it, which was to his credit, but she saw it go in. He looked at the mountains a while. Then he looked at her. I should have told you. I didn't, because I knew you wouldn't let me if I asked first. You'd have said no, and meant it, and I'd have had to stand by and watch a man I know for a snake wait out your winter, hoping you'd slip. A pause. So I told myself I was protecting the spring. But you're right. I wasn't only protecting the spring. I was deciding for you. And putting me next to Voss in the same breath is a hard thing to hear. And a fair one, and I'm not going to argue it down. He held her gaze. I was wrong. He said it plainly, without decoration, without the softening that men reach for when they want an apology to also be a defense. Helping you didn't give me the right to decide for you. So here's where it stands, and these are real, not manners. He turned to face her square. The $8 can stand as a loan, you pay it back out of wages, on whatever schedule suits you, and I keep a receipt like any other debt. Or I go to Voss and reverse the entry, and you carry the note yourself, the whole of it, and I keep my hands off it entirely and say nothing the next time you're short. Or we tear it up between us as a thing one neighbor does for another that never gets counted either way. You choose. All three are genuinely on the table, and I'll not think less of you or more of you for any of them. It's yours to say. She looked at the fence. She looked at Hope, grazing a few yards off with the whole piece of an animal that has found a good place and knows it. One white ear turned lazily toward them as though keeping account. That, she said, is the first thing you've said today that sounds like respect. Yes, he said. I know. I'm better at solving a thing than explaining it. When I care about something I act instead of speak. I always have. It's a steady failing, and I've known it about myself 20 years, and I'm working on it, later than I should be. He held her gaze. I closed that note because I could not stand to watch you carry it. Not because you couldn't, because you could. Better than I've carried my own accounts in 6 years, and we both know it. I did it because I didn't want you to have to. That's the whole honest reason, and it's not a good enough one to have done it in secret, and I know that now. I should have found a way to say it out loud at the time, and let you tell me no if no was your answer. She stood at the fence in the cold and looked at a man who had paid a debt and said nothing about it for 3 weeks, and had just laid out 3 genuine options and named a steady failing without dressing it up and taking you like Voss on the chin without once flinching away from it. She thought about a house that had started to feel like hers between November and December. She thought about a tool on a workbench, and second reads at the breakfast table, and a lamp burning late seen from a ridge by a man who watched 14 months and never came to the door because he thought watching was the respectful thing. She thought about her father. Take him to Robert Shaw, he'll treat the animal right. She had thought he meant the horse. I'll repay it through wages, she said. 2 a month, until it's clear, with a receipt, like any debt. I don't want it torn up, and I don't want it reversed. I want it to be a plain thing between us that we both know the shape of. She paused. And Voss stays gone. I'll not have that spring hanging over either of us. I'll carry the note current myself from here, and if the day ever comes that I can't, you'll hear it from me first, in words before it's a crisis. That's the trade. You stop deciding things about me in silence, and I stop deciding I have to face everything alone. Both halves. Not one, both halves, he said. Yes, and you ask me. Next time. Yes, he said. I will. I give you my word on it, which is a thing I don't spend loosely. I know you don't, she said. That's why I asked for it. Behind them, Tom, who had been checking the east run of fence and had heard most of it, waited until she'd ridden off, then walked over to Robert. April, Tom said. Robert looked at him. What? I'm betting April. For the wedding. He went back to work. Voss did not give it up easily. A closed note took the spring out of his reach the honest way. But a man who has waited 14 months for a piece of water does not simply ride away. And in the second week of January, he tried the one move he had left. He went around Cedar Falls, letting it be known, in the careful way that never quite says the thing outright, that the Callum woman had moved herself onto a bachelor's ranch and talked that bachelor into paying her father's debts, and that people might draw their own conclusions about the arrangement and the kind of woman who'd make it. It was meant to do to her standing what he could no longer do to her land. Nora heard it the way you hear that kind of thing, from a woman on the market road who told her with the specific kindness of someone delivering bad news in a friendly register. She thanked her and meant it, and she did not take it to Robert, because Robert took a slight against her personally, and a problem taken personally stops being something you can solve and starts being something you have to survive. She needed him steady, not stung. But Robert heard it too, in town, at the feed store, from a man who thought he was doing him a courtesy, and Robert Shaw, who avoided a confrontation the way other men avoid a snake, not from fear but from a deep dislike of the noise and the waste of it, walked the length of the Cedar Falls boardwalk that same afternoon to where Harlan Voss stood outside the lending office, and stopped in front of him, and the whole street felt it happen before a word was said. The way you feel weather change before you can name what changed. You've said some things, Robert said. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. His voice, at its ordinary pitch, carried the way a big still thing carries, and half the street had gone quiet to listen anyhow. About a woman who works for me. About her character. And about mine. And about what a person might conclude from the two of them put together. Voss arranged his face into something civil. I only said what folks were already thinking, Shaw. A man can't be blamed for the shape of a thing that speaks for itself. Nora Callum kept her father's land alone for 14 months, Robert said, as though Voss had not spoken, through 2 winters and a season of grief, while men who talk the way you talk sat warm by their stoves and agreed with each other that she couldn't. She found $11 my own suppliers had been quietly skimming off me for half a year, and she found it in 3 days, when I'd not have found it in 3 years. She is the most capable person in this valley, and it isn't a near thing. The debt she owed you is paid, in full, at your own counter, early, in coin. Your business with her is finished. He let that sit 1 beat, and when he went on his voice had dropped, which somehow made it louder. You lent a grieving girl money at a rate you knew she'd struggle to carry. And then you counted her every stumble like a man counting cards, waiting on the day her land would fall in your lap and you could sell her father's spring off to the mill trade. That's the shape of the thing that speaks for itself, Voss. I expect the folks on this street can see it now, it said plain. The street was very quiet. Voss's civil face had gone tight around the edges. Say another word about her, her name, her character, or the arrangement of my house, anywhere in this valley, Robert said. And you'll take it up with me directly, and I promise you I'll not be near as patient about it as she was. Are we clear? Or do you need it a second time? Voss looked at the quiet street, at the faces turned toward him, the storekeep in his apron. 2 women stopped with their baskets, the smith wiping his hands slow in his doorway, all of them having heard the whole account laid out plain, and he found that there was nothing he could say that would not cost him more than silence cost him. He put his hat on and got on his horse and rode out of Cedar Falls, and by supper the whole valley had the story, and it was not the story Voss had set out to tell. A man who has built his standing on being owed does not do well the day the town decides it does not like him, and Cedar Falls decided that afternoon, out loud, on the boardwalk. He did not come back. Some men make their noise until the noise stops working, and then they gather what they can carry and go looking for somewhere it still does. By spring he had sold his paper and moved on down the line, and the valley was cleaner for the lack of him. Robert told her about it that evening himself, plainly, standing in the kitchen doorway, because after Ask Me Next Time, he was not going to be a man who did things about her without her knowing. "I said my piece to Voss in town today," he said, "about what he's been spreading. I know you'd have handled it yourself. I didn't do it because you couldn't. I did it because it was said to me, in front of me, and I wasn't going to stand there and let it pass." A pause. "I'm telling you so you hear it from me and not the road." She looked at him a long moment. "That," she said, "is exactly the right way to have done a thing you didn't ask me about first." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face, and did not quite land, and was better for not landing. The winter softened. The drifts pulled back off the lower pastures, and the creek came loose and ran loud, and the light lasted a little longer at both ends of the day. Robert courted her the way he did most things, plainly, without performance, and with a kind of grave attention that she came to understand was worth 10 times the easy words other men spent so freely. He did not court her with speeches. He courted her by learning how she took her own coffee and having it ready, by mending the cinch on her saddle before she noticed it was worn, by listening when she talked about her father with the whole of himself, and remembering a week later the small things she'd said, and asking after it, so she knew it had gone in and been kept. He brought wildflowers once in March, with the slight discomfort of a man who knows the gesture is right and isn't sure of the execution, holding them a little away from himself as though they might go off. She put them in the window over the sink without remarking on it, and he did not remark on her not remarking, and the flowers sat there a week, and it was, between the two of them, an entire conversation. He tried to tell her the dress she wore one Sunday suited her, and got as far as "that dress suits you," the color, and then seemed to hear himself, and glanced sidelong at Tom, who had suddenly found urgent business with a harness buckle in the far corner of the yard, and tried again "the color suits you," which was not an improvement, and knew it, and gave it up, and she understood that this was how he was built, that the words came hard to him precisely because they mattered to him, that a man to whom flattery came easy was a man who spent it easy, and she found, on balance, that she would rather have the man who choked on a compliment because it was true than the man who poured them out because they were cheap. On an evening in April she was making supper, when he came in from the south pasture with the particular quality of a man who has decided a thing and isn't going to let himself wait any longer, because waiting had become its own kind of cowardice, and he had never had much use for that. He sat at the table. He looked at his hands, which had built and mended half of everything she could see through the window, and then he looked at her. "I used to think this house was quiet, because I liked it quiet," he said. 6 years I told myself that. I know now it was only waiting for someone whose absence I'd notice. And I notice, now, when you ride up to your own place for a night, the whole house goes back to being just quiet. And I sit in it, and I don't care for it anymore. You spoiled it." He almost smiled, and did not, and it was better for it. "Nora Callum, will you marry me?" It was not quite a question. It was the only honest thing left to say, and he said it the way he said honest things, straight out, with nothing in front of it to hide behind. She stopped stirring. She turned around and looked at him, this large, quiet man at her table with his built hands folded in front of him, waiting on her answer the way he waited on everything worth having, patiently, prepared to be told no and to bear it. She thought about a Monday in November when she'd ridden 12 minutes with a horse she meant to sell and a price that shamed her, certain she was handing over the last thing she loved. She thought about how the man at the gate had looked not at the horse but at her, and had heard, under the price, the thing she was not saying, and had answered that instead. She crossed to the table and sat across from him and put her hands on the wood, and he put his over them, carefully, the way he did everything he cared about not breaking. Yes, she said, the way she said everything that mattered, plainly, and all the way through, with nothing held back for safety. They married in June, in the Cedar Falls church, on a Saturday, with the high country summer laid out green beyond the doors. Tom sat in the third row, where he'd been since morning, which was the row a man takes when he has a stake in the outcome and wants a clear view. Nora wore a dress she'd made herself, cream linen, plain, cut to be worn again. Because she was still Nora Callum, and Nora Callum did not make a thing that could only be used once. Robert wore his one good shirt with the mild discomfort of a man who'd rather be in work clothes and was willing to be uncomfortable for an afternoon that warranted it. Before the ceremony, in the small room at the back of the church, Robert had knocked and come in with something wrapped in a piece of clean cloth. It was her father's leather-handled tool, cleaned and oiled. "He left it with me," Robert said. "By rights it should go back to the Callum place." Nora held it a moment and looked at the stamp in the handle, the mark her father set so a thing would always find its way home, and looked at Robert and thought about a man who had known this man well enough to lend him something and trust it back, and well enough to send his daughter to his gate with a horse and a price and a last instruction that had meant more than its words. She put it back in his hands. "Keep it. Between the two places, it'll get more use." He held it and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. Outside after, in the June light, Tom appeared at Robert's elbow. "April the 23rd, he said. "I win by 7 days. You bet April. I bet before May. The 23rd is before May. Technically a win." He held out his hand. Robert looked at it, reached into his pocket, and put a silver dollar in it. "You should have bet February," Robert said. "I knew February," Tom said. "I just didn't think you did." And he walked off, satisfied, a man who'd been right about a thing since November. The Callum place did not go to auction, not that November when it might have, and not ever. That was Nora's decision, and Robert did not argue it. The 40 acres were hers, her father's work, and her own 14 months of holding them together alone. And she was not going to let them go because she'd married a man with 500. The two properties ran alongside each other the way good neighboring outfits run, with the plain cooperation of two people who understood the same land and held separate claims on different parts of it. The Callum Spring stayed the Callum Spring, and no man built toward the mill trade ever put a pipe in it. Hope had the run of both places and took full advantage, and on one occasion lifted Tom's hat off a fence post and was found with it out in the south pasture, showing no remorse whatever. On an evening in the second spring, on the porch in the last of the light, Nora looked at Hope grazing in the near pasture and thought about a Monday in November, 2 hours to sundown, $4.40, and a white horse she had ridden 12 minutes to the one man her father had trusted. She thought about $10 that had turned into an east bedroom, and a pantry set right, and a debt closed at the wrong time for the right reason, and a fight she'd made a man see was hers to win. She thought about her father, who had left her a property and a horse and one instruction, who had not said Robert Shaw will give you a home, and had not said Robert Shaw is the man you'll marry, but had only said he'll treat the animal right. He had. He'd treated the horse right, and the accounts right, and Voss exactly as right as Voss deserved, and, in the end, Nora right, which meant honestly and patiently, and with the understanding that a woman who had held 40 acres alone for 14 months did not need saving. She needed fair terms. She needed the terms to stay what they were until she was ready for them to be something else. She needed a man who would name a steady failing and offer 3 real choices and ask, next time. Robert came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her and handed her one. Hope lifted his head from the grass and looked at them both with a calm assessment of an animal that has known since November exactly where it all belonged, and then went back to grazing. "Robert," she said, "my father knew." He looked at the white horse, and then at her. "Yes," he said, "I think he did." She held her coffee in the high country spring and looked at everything her father had left her, the land, the horse, the last instruction, and the man the instruction had led her to. He never wasted a word, her father. Not one. He had spent the last month of his life setting down each thing he could not stay to protect. In the one place it would do the most good, the ledger to her hands, the fence to the neighbor who'd help mend it, the tool to the man who'd bring it home, and the horse's road to the same man. And the last one, the shortest one, the one that had sounded like it was only about a horse, had turned out to be the largest thing he ever gave her. He had not been telling her where to sell an animal. He had been telling her, in the only way a proud man could tell a prouder daughter without her refusing it, where she could go when she had nothing left, and be met fairly, and be seen. Take him to Robert Shaw. He'll treat the animal right. He had known. Somehow, in the last thin month of his life, with his breath gone short and his time gone shorter, he had looked down the length of the years he would not get to see, and known that the man across the valley, who watched a lamp burn late for 14 months and would not intrude on a proud girl's grief, was the one man who would meet his daughter as an equal instead of a rescue. He had not arranged a marriage. He had done something harder and finer than that. He had pointed her at a fair man and trusted the 2 of them to find the rest of it themselves, in their own time, on their own terms, which was the only kind of finding that would ever have held her. That was what love looked like, she had learned, when it was honest. Not rescue. Not a man deciding for a woman because he cared for her, however kindly meant. A fair set of terms held to even when it cost him. A hard fight faced beside her instead of over her head. A man honest enough to be told he was wrong, and to hear it all the way to the bottom without flinching, and to change, and to give his word he'd ask, next time, and be a man whose word was worth the asking. It was a debt paid the wrong way, and then set right the right way, out loud, between equals. It was a tool going back and forth between 2 properties, carrying its way home in the mark on its handle, earning its keep the way her father had wanted, mourning no one. And it was a white horse, named Hope, standing at the rail in the last light of a second spring, who had pushed his nose into her shoulder on the worst morning of her life and carried her 12 minutes down the valley to a gate, and who had known, before either of the 2 people on that porch had let themselves know it, exactly where it was all going to come to rest. Robert reached over and took her empty cup and set it with his own on the porch board between them, and did not say anything, because there was nothing that wanted saying. Out in the near pasture, Hope cropped the new grass, unhurried, home. The mountains held the last of the light a while, the way they did, and then let it go. It was, without question, exactly right.